Okay, guys, welcome back. We're talking about life in the colonies. This is your SOL 3 lecture, Life in the Colonies. And so it says economic and political institutions in the colonies develop in ways that are typical of Europe. So many of these first colonists come from Europe, and they bring a lot of their customs and traditions and ways of and beliefs with them. But they're also a long way from home in a new country. All right. And they're interacting with new people. So they're interacting with Africans. They're interacting with Native Americans. So Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans are mingling with each other. They're exchanging ideas and culture. And so what we're going to see is a development in ways that are typical of Europe, but distinctly American. All right, climate and soil conditions and other natural resources are going to shape regional economic development. And throughout the colonies, they had a belief in strong ownership of property. All right, strong ownership of property and free enterprise. Free enterprise meaning you own your own business, you own your own factors of production, and you own the profit in that business. All right, let's look at religion in the colonies. All right, so in the New England colonies, you have Puritans. They called them Puritans because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of Catholic ritual. They weren't terribly popular in England. They were being persecuted, so they left to come here to seek religious freedom. In the middle colonies, remember, it's diverse. The middle colonies is probably one of the most diverse places in the world when it comes to religion. And if you were Jewish in the 17th century, New York and New Jersey are one of the most tolerant places in the world. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, that's hostile feelings toward Jewish people in Europe during this time. There's even they're murdering Jews in Russia during this time. So New York and New Jersey are unique places. Huguenots are French Protestants. You have Quakers in Pennsylvania. You have Presbyterians in New Jersey. In the South, like always, the Southern colonies are more closely tied to England. All right. So the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is predominant in the South. Okay, let's look at economic characteristics of the colonies. All right, so in New England, remember we said climate and soil conditions matter. And so it's rocky soil, it's colder, you're not going to have a long growing season like, say, in the southern colonies or parts of the middle colonies. So they don't do any big plantation agriculture. They do shipbuilding, fishing, lumber, small scale subsistence farming. If you subsist on something, you live off of it, you survive off of it. So subsistence farming is growing just enough to feed you and your family, but not really to take to market and turn a profit. All right. And later on, we're going to see manufacturing emerge in the form of water-powered textile mills. Right. Puritans believed in hard work and thrift. And thrift is kind of like, I always use my grandmother as an example. My grandmother, Edith Bingman, washes plasticware. All right. She's thrifty. She uses things up. She's resourceful. She doesn't like to waste things. That's thrift. All right. In the middle colonies, you have shipbuilding, small scale farming, so bigger than subsistence farming, but not the size of the big plantations we're going to see in the southern colonies. All right. And you have trade. New York and Philadelphia are going to be major commercial centers. They're seaports. They have deep harbors. You can pull a boat up close to the shore, unload and load cargo. And so they become centers of trade. Commerce is trade. So a commercial center is a center of trade. All right. In the southern colonies, you have eastern coastal lowlands that are great for large plantations. Plantations are characterized by cash crops. crops that are lucrative. Usually they're luxury crops like tea or coffee or something like that. In this case, it's rice, tobacco, and indigo. All right. In the mountains and valleys of Appalachia, they're not doing plantation agriculture. If you've been in the western part of the state, you can see why. It's the land is not good for it. Instead, they do small scale subsistence farming. There's that word again, subsistence, and hunting and trading. Let's look at the social characteristics of the colonies. All right, so in the New England colonies, it's all about your religious standing. The ministers are in charge, and everybody does what they say. Church and government are one. They're intolerant. It means they don't allow anybody to believe anything differently than what they believe. All right, and they don't like dissenters. This word dissenters means anybody who challenges the connection between the Puritan church and the government. All right, a dissenter in reality, a dissenter is somebody that goes against the authority. So, like if you pulled your cell phone out in my class, you would be a dissenter, right? Well, the Puritans didn't tolerate dissent. They didn't like anybody to go against their established way. All right, especially anybody who challenged the connection between religion and government. You had some people showing up in the New England colony that weren't really Puritans, that weren't really there fleeing religious persecution. They were just trying to do business. And they did not like the strict Puritan mindset. And so many of them ended up leaving. One of them is Roger Williams. Roger Williams left Rhode Island left the Massachusetts Bay Colony and founded Rhode Island. Okay, so he was fleeing persecution by the Puritans. All right, in the middle colonies, remember, it's a mix. It's flexible. So you have multiple religious groups who believe in religious tolerance. They're okay with you having different beliefs. All right, they have a middle class of skilled artisans. An artisan is a person with a trade, like a blacksmith, a barrel maker, a shoemaker. All right, so these skilled artisans are going to become like America's first middle class. You also have entrepreneurs, people that start their own business, and small farmers. All right, in the southern colonies, it's all about your family status. It's in your last name. Remember that all of these big landowners are the descendants of wealthy English nobles. So the first big land grants in the southern colonies came from the king, and he gave them to wealthy English nobles, those cavaliers. And so their descendants are linked to these wealthy English nobles. So family status and last name is important, and large landowners dominate the colonial government. The large landowners dominate in the society. They dominate the government. They dominate the legislature. So we'll talk about the House of Burgesses. They are the Burgesses. All right. They maintain an allegiance with the king and with the Church of England, and they have close social ties to England. Out in the mountains, it's a little bit different. You've got hunters and traders. Most of them are Scots, Irish, and English. All right, let's look at political life in the colonies. All right, so the first representative government arises in Jamestown in the 1600s. All right, and this is the Virginia House of Burgesses. It's a representative legislature. So a legislature is a group of lawmakers. All right, we have a Congress. That's our national legislature. We have a Virginia General Assembly. That's our state legislature, which back then was called the Virginia House of Burgesses. And basically all of these guys just represent everybody else. We have a representative democracy today. There's 330 million people in the United States. There's too many of us for every single person to vote on every single thing. So we have representatives. All right, in New England, they use direct democracy. Athenian, remember Athens from World One? Direct democracy. Direct democracy, I always like to say there's no middleman, there's no representatives. You just vote. They would get together, they'd have town hall meetings, and they would vote on things, just like back in Athens. Here's an example of Athenian direct democracy. Athens liked to vote on all kinds of stuff. And once a year, Athens would have a special vote called the ostracism, where basically they would all line up and they would vote for one person, all right? And they would vote on one person they wanted to see leave Athens and never come back. And they called it an ostracism because they would write that person's name on a shell called an ostraca. And if you got the most votes, you were voted out of Athens. And archaeologists have found the same ostraca with the same handwriting and the same name over and over and over again. So it appears that people were trying to, vote multiple times to try to vote the same person out. All right. In the middle colonies, we see a reflection of the basic rights of Englishmen. These are things like life, liberty, and property, private property ownership. The idea that the purpose of the government is to protect those things. So very democratic ideals that are going to be very influential later on when we create a new society based on these principles. Big landowners in the South are dominant. I've already said that. They are the leaders in the colonial legislatures. So you could call the Southern colonies an aristocracy. That is a rule by the elite. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a religious movement. It's a religious movement that laid the foundation for the revolution. Let's see why. All right, here's an example of Great Awakening sermon by Jonathan Edwards. The Great Awakening is a religious movement. It's sweeping Europe. It's sweeping the colonies. And the preachers who are in this religious movement, they're not the official ordained ministers in the official church. These are guys who have taken upon themselves to go stand under the big tree and preach to crowds of people. And when they preach, it's all fire and brimstone. So take a look. It says, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect, or pours you in his dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. So he's saying, the God that holds you over the fire is disgusted by you, and he might as well. Supposedly, people would faint. This was like really, really hard-hitting stuff, and people would just pass out listening to it. It was very, very popular, but it's doing something else. So the Great Awakening was a religious movement. But check it out. Back then, church attendance was not an option. You had to be there. So these folks were defying authority by not going to the official church and instead going to listen to people like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield under a tree down the road. All right? So they're challenging authority. And this is a time where you just didn't do that. People back then really didn't question authority very much, mainly because it could get you killed. And if you were in my World History 2 class, I would explain to you about the great chain of being and the ideas that people believed about social and government orders and things like that. But we take for granted that you can challenge authority. They didn't. But the Great Awakening encouraged people to challenge authority. So that's one way. That's one way that it laid the foundation. It also unified the colonists. We have 3 distinct colonies that are very different, but they're going to have to work and act together because pretty soon they're going to be taking on the most powerful empire on the planet. All right. So, again, the ministers and preachers were usually officials, ordained. They were higher authorities. Awakening ministers were not. All right. So this means The Great Awakening helped break down respect for higher authority. The new faiths are also more democratic. If you go to the official church, the pews up front are for the big landowners, for the elite. And the farther you sit back, the less important, the less wealthy you are, right? But at the Great Awakening sermon, it's first come, first serve, standing shoulder to shoulder. It doesn't matter if you're elite. It doesn't matter what your last name is. So it's more democratic, more democratic. And don't forget, like I said, it unified the colonies because it was a national occurrence. Think Super Bowl effect. The Super Bowl is a national occurrence that unifies people. It gives us all something to relate to. All right. Slavery is going to be introduced in 1619 in Jamestown. And it is going to quickly replace indentured servitude as the labor system in the South. All right. And this is going to be the divisive issue that will eventually lead to civil war. All right. We need to talk a little bit about mercantilism to understand European economic values and how they don't quite work for the colonists. So mercantilism is essentially this idea that think of like a greedy octopus. You know what an octopus is? It's got 8 tentacles, right? But think of one that's like really, really greedy, and it wants everything for itself. Well, think of England as the head of this very greedy octopus, okay? And it wants to reach out and get as much stuff as it can, right? So it's reaching out, it's trying to reach out, and it wants to grab tobacco from Virginia, it wants to grab, tea from India, all right? It wants to grab gold and slaves from Africa, it wants to grab sugarcane from the Caribbean, all right? Hey, and it doesn't want France or Spain to get any of that stuff. So the idea of mercantilism is to get wealthy, basically sell more stuff than you buy, and for everything to benefit the head, the mother country, the head of the greedy octopus. So what are the tentacles in this weird analogy that I'm using? How do you reach out to Virginia and grab tobacco if you're England? You do it with a colony. You do it with a colony. You reach out and grab things with a colony. So I'll ask you this. Who is getting the short end of the stick here? Who is getting the most benefit? Who is getting the least? The head or the tentacle? Which would you rather be? All right. So England passes the Navigation Act, and they tell the colonists, you can only trade with England. You can only buy tea from England. You can only sell tobacco to England. Well, the colonists are going to have a big problem with that because remember, they have strong beliefs in private ownership of factors of production, that's farms and factories and things like that. And they have a profit motive. They want to make money. Well, if you want to make money, you sell to the person that's willing to pay you most. You buy from the person that's willing to sell something to you the cheapest. The colonists were not free to do that, and that's going to be a problem moving forward. All right. We also see significant conflict with Native Americans over land ownership. The Europeans just assumed that once they gained control of land, it was theirs to use exclusively, whereas Native Americans saw land ownership as more of a mutual thing. So basically, like if they were essentially giving Europeans access to the land to use as well, but they didn't see that as excluding them from the land. And so this is going to lead to some violent conflict. We're going to have a long period of neglect. This is called salutary neglect, where the colonies are just going to be left alone. But then over time, England is going to try to assert more control over the colonies. And the analogy I always use with this is if I came in at the beginning of the school year and I sat behind my desk and I didn't do anything, and I left you alone, you would, get used to having a free block. All right. But then let's say in May, I stood up and I tried to make rules and start teaching. You would get pretty upset. You would rebel. You would be like, we've been sitting here all year. You've never said a word. Now, all of a sudden, at the end of the year, you want to stand up and start making us do stuff. And so the colonies kind of worked the same way. The king just left them alone. They were left to sort of govern themselves and do business the way they wanted to. And what we're going to see is the king start to try to control the colonies more later, and they're going to get pretty upset about that. Don't forget that there's a landed aristocracy in the South, and we're going to see mixed economies flourish in the middle colonies in New England. All right. I have seen from time to time on social media, people try to compare slavery with indentured servitude. They're not the same. Indentured servants worked for a period of time and then had their freedom. Indentured servants weren't always treated great, but they were not treated anywhere nearly as badly as slaves who were enslaved for their lives, whose children were born into slavery. If an indentured servant had a child, that child was not also an indentured servant. Slaves were not considered people. They were considered property. They could be murdered at will. You could do terrible things to them. Indentured servants didn't have to deal with all that. So eventually, indentured servitude is going to replace or be replaced rather by slavery as the primary means of agricultural production in the middle and southern colonies. And that demand for slaves is only going to continue to grow. It's going to grow considerably once the southern states, colonies now, states later, switch to cotton production. All right. So, like I said, at first, labor needs are met by indentured servants, mostly from Scotland, England, and Ireland. But eventually, people brought against their will from West Africa will fill that that labor demand. All right. And so very few Africans worked as indentured servants. Most were enslaved. Slavery in British North America, as well as in the Sugar Islands and places like Brazil, is going to become based on race. Okay? And so the numbers of free African Americans, later African Americans, free Africans living in the South, is very small. Over time, larger and larger numbers of these folks will be brought across on the dreaded Middle Passage. This is the miserable voyage across the Atlantic Ocean where people are chained down to shelves in the dark, damp holds of ships, and many of them die on the journey, suffer endlessly. But and so the entire southern economy is going to be based on plantation slave labor. And if you look, so this is the 1660s, all right, and you see indentured servitude is primarily being used, but indentured servants, there weren't as many of them available to meet demand. The British had also gained control of the slave trade, and so slavery was getting cheaper, and indentured servants were looked at as kind of dangerous. What was happening was they were becoming, once they were working off their contracts, they didn't have land, but they did have guns, and so they were looked at as kind of a threat, whereas slaves were people that could be controlled absolutely for their lifetimes. All right, this kind of slavery is going to divide our nation. You can see by the 1700s, it's the predominant labor system. It's going to divide our nation, okay, and it is eventually going to lead us to civil war. Slavery is the cause of the Civil War. All right. Let me go back because I want to address this symbol right here. Is the symbol of the Society of Friends, which is it's an abolitionist society. formed in England that will eventually find its way to North America. Now, I don't really like this symbol. What does it look like he's doing in that picture? Well, it looks like he's begging. He's begging for his freedom. And I would argue that that is not really what happened. Enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans frequently fought for their freedom. We're going to talk about numerous slave uprisings, uprisings aboard slave ships while traveling across the Atlantic were incredibly common. So common that those who worked on the slavers knew, the sailors that worked on the slave ships knew, it wasn't if, it was when it was going to happen. The people in the South lived in perpetual fear of slave uprisings, and whenever the opportunity came, Revolutionary War, War of 1812, to fight and earn freedom, they took it. And in the Civil War, 200,000 African Americans, most of whom are former slaves themselves, are going to leave and fight for the United States. So they fought for their freedom. They didn't beg for it. All right. So the Society of Friends were well-intentioned making this symbol, but I don't really like this symbol. Slaves' family units were completely disregarded. Mothers separated from sons, daughters separated from fathers. They thought nothing of taking a child from a mother's arms and selling that child away to another plantation, never to be seen again. Slaves' behavior was strictly governed. They were not allowed to read, right? Because if they learned, they could become dangerous. They weren't allowed to get married. They weren't allowed to convert to Christianity, all right? And punishments were harsh. And you can see this man, his back is scarred from years and years of being whipped. So that was the primary means of punishment. They might also do something called hobbling. They would hobble you, where they would cut off your toes or the front part of your foot. All sorts of just terrible mutilations and punishments because the enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans were not considered people. They were considered chattel, which means property. And so they were not afforded the basic decencies that we afford people. And they tried to dehumanize these folks. They took away their names and tried to take away their culture. It didn't work though. They retained their culture. They forged new kinship ties. And we'll talk about all that as we go through the course. This concludes our SOL 3 lecture. Make sure that you guys do the discussion board. Make sure you guys read the narrative and answer the questions. And make sure you fill out the guided notes.